Now, in previous lessons, we saw how JavaScript allows us to create higher order functions. When we talk about higher order functions, we're referring to the function that's able to take functions as inputs. So in this case, the add event listener is our higher order function, as it takes the respond to key function as an input. Now, what about the other side? What about the function that gets passed in as an input? Well, this is actually called a callback function because it allows us to wait for something to finish happening, for example, waiting for a click event, and then the callback function gets called back and executed. So previously, when our button detects a click, it calls the callback function. And in this case, when the document or the entire web page detects a key press, then the document will call this function respond to key. Now, when that happens, we can get it to send us some information that it'll only know once the event happens, namely, say, which button was clicked or which keyboard key was pressed. So if we head into our Wikipedia page again and we inspect on our JavaScript object, and we again gain access to the H1 using the $0 sign. Now, we know that we can add an event listener by simply saying $0, add event listener, say click, and once that does happen, let's call this anonymous function, and we can console log something. Now, in this case, all that we're doing is saying that attach this event listener to $0, which of course is this H1, and get it to listen for click events. When it detects those click events, get it to call this function. Now, this is a very simple form of the event listener, but as we saw in the last lesson, we can also get the event that triggered this function passed back through the callback function. So instead of console logging simply I got clicked, we can actually console log the actual event that triggered the function. So in this case, if I hit enter and I click on this JavaScript H1, then you can see that it's console logging the event that triggered the click. So in this case, it was a mouse click, and you can see all of these properties that are associated with that mouse event. For example, which part of the screen did I click on? What was the type of event? And a whole bunch of other things. Now, when you're creating this anonymous function, you can call this parameter anything you want. You'll commonly see it as E or EVT for event, and it'll work exactly the same. Now, the reason for this is because, say if we create a function called say hi, and we give the name of the input as 2, and then we say console log hello, plus whatever input we got. So now we can call this function saying say hi to Tom, and it'll say hello Tom. Now we can also create a function, say hi, and instead of calling our input 2, we call it name. So now we're saying hi to name, and again, it does exactly the same thing, which says hello to the input that we pass in, which is name. So now we can again say hi, Tom, and it'll still say hello, Tom. So the name that you give the input really doesn't matter. It's the same as when you create a variable called name, or you create a variable called 2. It's completely up to you what you call it. So this is why when we create an event listener, and we give that input any name, say E, it will still work exactly the same, passing in the event that triggered the callback function. But the slightly crazy part is that this callback function is not called by us, but it's called by the object that experienced the click. And when that happens, we can get it to send us some information that it'll only know once the event happens. For example, in our drum kit, then that's which button got clicked by the user. So this callback function can be a little bit confusing and a little bit mysterious. So again, as before, I want to show you both sides of the coin. So let's pretend to create the function add event listener, but so that it's not confusing, we'll call it another add event listener. And as we know, it takes two inputs, the first being the type of event, and the second being the callback. So this add event listener will do a number of complex things that detects when an event happens. But when an event does happen, then it'll create an event object. And let's call that object event that happened, just so that we're clear. So let's say that we pressed a key on the keyboard. Then the event object that gets created will capture a number of things about that event. For example, what was the event type? In this case, it was a key press event. And it might have another property such as, well, which key then? Let's say that we press the P key to generate this event. And it might have other things like duration of key press. And let's say this was equal to 2 seconds. So when the event happens, namely pressing a key on the keyboard, then this object gets created based on that event. And now we can pass that object back through the callback method so that the programmer, if they wish, they can get the event object and use it to see what event triggered this event listener. But of course, we know that our callback doesn't get called for all types of events, right? So in fact, our add event listener might check to see if event that happened dot event type is actually equal to the type of event that the programmer was looking to detect. And then, and only then, do we actually trigger the callback function. So if this is our function, add event listener, and this is the part that we can't really see, then the part that we do see and the part that we write is actually just calling the add event listener. And we pass in a number of inputs, right? Say we're passing that we're looking to detect the key press event. And when that happens, we want it to trigger an anonymous function that essentially just does some console logging. So console log. And what we want to log is the event that triggered the callback. So now, if I hit enter, then you can see that when the event gets triggered by, say, a key press on the keyboard, and if the type of event was equal to the type that we were looking for, namely key press, then we trigger the callback. And the callback can send us that event object, which now gets logged in our console. So you can see this output looks really similar. Say if we were simply using proper code, not our simplified code, and we said document add event listener to listen for key press, and once you do detect that key press, then call the anonymous function, passing in the event that triggered the key press, and then we're simply just going to console log that event object. So now when I hit enter and I press any key on the keyboard, then you can see we get back this object called keyboard event, and it has a number of properties, including things like, for example, the key that was pressed to trigger this event. So again, I find that it usually helps to understand what exactly is going on here by using the debugger and stepping through each step of the way. So let's try this again, but this time we're going to use the debugger to see what's happening. So again, I'm going to call another add event listener, passing in the type of event that we're looking to detect, and also the callback that should happen when it does get detected. But just above, I'm also going to add the debugger keyword so that when I hit enter, I enter the debug mode. So now I'm going to step through our function calls, and we begin by calling add another event listener, passing in these two inputs. So that takes us to where that function was declared, and we step through each of the lines of code. The first thing that happens is we're waiting to detect an event, and this part of the code waits to detect an event. Let's say that in this imaginary world, I press the P key on the keyboard. Now at that point, then this event that happened object gets created and it captures a lot of information about my key press. Namely, that the event type was of the key press type, the key that I pressed was P, and I pressed on it for 2 seconds. So now that we have this event object created after I triggered the event, then our code will check if the type of the event that happened is equal to the type that the program was looking for. Then it will go ahead and trigger the callback function. And if we step through, then you can see that the callback function is, of course, this part, the function that we used as an input. And it goes ahead and tries to log the event object. And this is when we see that event show up down here. And that is how we came about getting hold of this event object. Now, callbacks are notoriously difficult concepts to grasp, and even some developers who've been working for a number of years struggle with this particular concept. So don't worry if this is the first time you've come across it and it seems a little bit confusing. What I encourage you to do is to recreate our add event listener function and just go through the motions of what I did in this lesson without having to watch the video. Play around with the code and also play around with the debugger and see how the code works behind the scenes. Now, we're going to come back to this topic of callbacks many more times in the coming lessons. So this is not the only time that you'll come across it. And for all the difficult concepts, I try to sprinkle in plenty of repetition so that I make sure that you really do get it, because it is a really important concept that we'll come to rely on when we're creating more and more complex web apps.